Right. Well, we are Scandinavian, so we will try to start as promptly as possible. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar this morning. My name is Peter Sandberg, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Swedish Chamber of Commerce, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to what I have to say, it feels like it's been a while since we hosted a proper webinar. It feels like ages ago, but my sense of time is sort of up in the air since the pandemic started. I don't know about yourselves. Most of our autumn was filled with in-person events. Saying that, I think this event is perfectly suited for a webinar, but nonetheless, we want you to get actively involved and using the Q&A function to get your questions in early, please. It's great to see so many of you joining us this morning and tuning in for an update on what to expect from the world in 2022. And the year certainly started off with a lot of drama left, right, and center. The dramatic Winter Olympics and the famous winter resort of Beijing, tensions at the Ukrainian border, US midterm elections, Partygate, and the very, very important Swedish national elections in September. Here to help guide us today is the man behind The Economist's annual publication carrying the same name, The World Ahead in 2022. So please welcome Tom Standage, Deputy Editor at The Economist. Tom, a warm welcome from our end to yourself. Now, for over a century, the Swedish Chamber of Commerce has been here to support businesses and creating a platform for people to meet, share, and develop. And we continue doing so with a lot of love and confidence in 2022. So do have a look at some of our upcoming activities on sec.org.uk as well. As I said, today's session is all for you, so let's keep it interactive, ask questions and get involved, and we will do our very best to facilitate this. Now, for housekeeping, very briefly, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and write your questions. We should all be familiar with this now after 2 years of working pandemic life. If you experience any technical issues, please contact one of the SEC team members using the chat function. And please note that the webinar today will be recorded and made available for members afterwards. I'm now going to hand over to the chair for today's session, a dear friend to the chamber, Mr. Tomas Gärdfors, partner and head of Nordics at city law firm Norton Rose Fulbright, the best view in the city. Thank you for joining us, Tomas, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's great to be on yet another one of these webinars, and I'm quite excited about today's topic. As you said, Tom Standage, who we have on here today, is the Deputy Editor of The Economist and the editor of The World Ahead 2022. He has been with The Economist for quite some time, actually, since 1998. With a strong focus on technology, but in a very interesting way. If you dig and you find some very fascinating articles written by him, and he has written no less than 6 books. One of them is called The Victorian Internet, which I find the title alone, it would be a challenge. Very interesting to listen to Tom now. He will have a presentation when he goes through the predictions. And so please use your Q&A session to use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and we will try to group them at the end. But do remember that this is predictions for 2022 on a global scale. So unfortunately, we'll not be able to dwell into the Partygate or the Swedish election or whatever we have. So listen to what Tom has to say and see this opportunity to look at it from a global and predictive perspective. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And yes, one of the things I do at The Economist is look after our annual The World Ahead. And you can see some previous editions of this annual here. And essentially, this is where we ask our journalists to give us not the perspective of what's going to happen in the next few days, like we normally would in the weekly edition, but what we think is going to happen in the coming year. And it's quite an unusual publication for us. It's the one of the few places where Economist journalists actually get a byline, so that you can see their names. And the other thing about this publication is that we are joined by experts in other fields, leaders in other fields. So in this year's edition, the World Ahead 2022, we have contributions from Cyril Ramaphosa, President of South Africa. We have the founders of BioNTech, telling us what they think is going to happen next with the mRNA technology that's been used in the vaccines and where else that could be used. We have Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist and activist. So we have lots of people weighing in about what they think is going to happen in the coming year. This annual comes out every November. So what I'm going to give you now is my summary of the 10 big themes that come out of what all of those people have to say, and essentially joining the dots between them. And these are global trends. We can talk about other things that have happened since these predictions came out. The two big ones since we published in November have been the rise of the Omicron variant and also events in Ukraine. I think those are the two big things. But for the most part, this is a sort of view from the moon, like you normally get from The Economist. So here are my 10 themes to watch for this year. So let's jump in with number 1. And a big theme that plays out in lots of areas is the rivalry between America and China in particular, but more broadly between democracy and autocracy. And so what we are seeing here is both countries wanting to demonstrate the superiority of their respective political systems and their ability to deliver stability and growth and innovation for their populations. And this is something that Joe Biden has been very clear about. In his first press conference as president last year, he said this is a battle between the utility of democracies in the 21st century and autocracies. And he says we've got to prove that democracy works. Alas, dysfunctional politics make America a rather poor advertisement for the merits of democracy right now. Democracy's been in recession globally for more than a decade, since the global financial crisis. So Joe Biden had a summit for democracies in December where he tried to rally democracies around the world behind America as the leader of the free world. And at the same time, we've had sort of sniping from China saying that actually they think that their system, which they have sometimes referred to as socialist democracy, is fairer and delivers better outcomes for its people. So this is very much a battle of these two ideologies. But I think this year we've got some other elections coming up that are also going to be seen through this lens of like the health of democracy, litmus tests for just how democracy is doing. And I think the ones to watch this year are going to be in France, Brazil and Hungary in particular. In France, we've got this sort of Trumpy character, Eric Zemmour. In Brazil, Bolsonaro is doing a Trump. He's doing badly in the polls and is talking about how the election is rigged if he doesn't win it, and how he might not step aside if he doesn't think the result is fair. And in Hungary, of course, Viktor Orban suddenly faces the prospect of a united opposition. And so I think how those elections go will give us some sense of the extent to which voters are still keen on the sort of populist autocratic style of leadership that we've seen emerging in democratic countries in recent years. But later this year, we are going to see the sharpest contrast between America and China's political systems, because on the one hand, we're going to have the midterm elections in the US, and one of the most reliable rules of politics in America is that whoever holds the White House does badly in the midterms, and that does seem to be likely at the moment, although anything could happen between now and then. But the consensus view is that Joe Biden and the Democrats will lose control of the House and probably the Senate too, and will then have even less scope to get things done than they do now. And this sort of glorious, chaotic carnival of democracy in America will contrast with the extremely closely stage-managed Communist Party Congress in China, at which Xi Jinping will be confirmed in power for at least another 5 years, rather than handing over to someone else, as would normally be the case with Chinese presidents after 10 years. And so I think this is going to be a very striking contrast. The Chinese are going to be saying, look at the merits of having this predictability, this stability, the same person in charge, you know where they're coming from. Whereas in America, the prospect of a second Trump presidency and Trump's continuing influence over the Republicans really plays into the Chinese government's view that democracy is dangerous and unstable, and you get these sort of handbrake turns from one administration to the next, and you can never quite be sure what America's view is going to be on things from climate change to trade to whether it's going to support its allies around the world. And this makes this unpredictability in America makes it much harder for supporters of democracy to make their case. Despite all this rivalry, there are lots of areas where China and America could in fact cooperate, like trade, climate, cybersecurity, nuclear non-proliferation. But we think it's unlikely that they will be doing any sorts of deals this year. Joe Biden won't want to look weak, and any sort of deal with the Chinese could be painted by Republicans as concessions. And Xi Jinping will be dialing up the nationalist propaganda to cement his own position and distract from any economic weakness in China. But there is a silver lining to this. I think Xi is so focused on stability and ensuring that everything goes smoothly this year that means making a move on Taiwan is much less likely, we think, in 2022. Okay, let's move on to what's happening with the pandemic. This chart here shows you how effectively the vaccines have been breaking the link between deaths and cases. This chart actually, we published this in November, so before Omicron emerged, but we've seen this even more strongly since Omicron has appeared. If you're well vaccinated, and many countries that are very well vaccinated have seen record numbers of cases as a result of Omicron, but they haven't seen the number of deaths going up in proportion. And so if that pattern persists, then Omicron will mark a step along the road towards COVID-19 becoming an endemic disease that's still dangerous to some people, but no longer requires dramatic, disruptive interventions like lockdowns. So essentially you move to a world where rather than trying to prevent the spread of the disease, you treat the symptoms, and that's something we do with other endemic diseases. A very big exception to that approach, of course, is China, which is the last major economy to be pursuing a suppression strategy of actually trying to stop the spread. This has worked very effectively in the early days of the pandemic, but it looks increasingly unsustainable now, given the higher transmissibility of Delta and now Omicron. And what doesn't help is that the Chinese vaccines are not very effective. They're not as good as the mRNA vaccines developed by Pfizer and Moderna. And the government has it's spent a lot of time and effort persuading people that its approach, suppression, is the right way to do it. It doesn't want to approve the Western vaccines for use in China. And so it looks like China is going to keep its borders closed and take this approach of keeping everything very locked down until it can develop its own effective mRNA vaccines, which could take a while. We may not see that until the end of this year or the beginning of next year. But the government has invested a lot of time and political capital in telling people just how scary the virus is and how safe it's keeping them. So it's quite difficult for them to reverse out of that position now. Meanwhile, in the developed world, we have good vaccine coverage in many countries, and the virus is no longer a deadly threat to most people. And what's even better news is that we also have new tools to fight the virus, as it will no doubt continue to evolve. We have these new antiviral pills, which are very promising because they work on all variants. They stop viruses multiplying inside your cells altogether, regardless of which sort of virus it is. And so that looks very promising. And then the other thing to keep an eye out for this year, and this could particularly help with improving vaccine coverage in the developing world, is new forms of the vaccine, which could be administered either through skin patches or through nasal inhalation. And this would be very, very useful because the best vaccines at the moment require cold chains, and they're much, much harder to distribute in the developing world. And so, Omicron is a reminder of the importance of ensuring global vaccine coverage because of this danger that new variants can emerge at any point and spread around the world. So new vaccines that would help us cover the whole world with vaccine coverage would be extremely helpful. So the end game, we know what it is. It's that the virus is everywhere, but it can be managed and it poses less danger. We're closer to that world than we were a year ago, but we're not there yet. Next, the economy. And this chart sort of tells you the story of what's been happening. This is what's happening in the US economy. And it shows you that there's been this massive shift during the pandemic of spending away from services and towards goods. And of course there has. It's very difficult to spend money on services like going to the theatre or going on holiday or going to restaurants when there's a lockdown. So instead, people have been spending money on goods, and they've been buying, big TVs and hot tubs and video games consoles and other things to make staying indoors a more pleasant experience. And what's now happened, because we have had a very rapid rebound of the economy in 2021, the demand for goods is now at this supernormal level, and this has put enormous strain on supply chains. It's driven up the cost of many goods, it's driven up the cost of energy, and so this is why we're seeing record levels of inflation in many countries. This chart here is the chart for the US. The surge in spending on goods rather than services is actually even bigger in Britain. The switch is the second largest in the OECD in the US, but we're seeing the same pattern across the OECD. And the result is this very high inflation. And this was something that economists and central bankers argued until sort of 3/4 of the way through last year was going to be temporary and would quickly pass with the help of a small rise of interest rates here or there. But now there is much more concern that inflation is going to be higher for longer, is going to stick around for longer, because in part of Omicron, which makes it harder to fight inflation, not because of lockdowns, but because of the need for people to isolate and so on. That does disrupt supply chains. It makes it harder to reopen businesses, particularly consumer-facing businesses, and so on. And so that means that shortages and delivery problems are likely to persist and price rises are unlikely to slow down. The virus has made inflation harder to fight, and central banks are going to face some very difficult choices this year. If you raise interest rates the usual way of fighting inflation, that doesn't actually help as much as it normally would, because it doesn't make people who are isolating and unable to work in factories or unloading lorries or working in restaurants, it doesn't make them better if you raise interest rates. And nor does it help unblock supply chains. In fact, it could make it worse. It could make it harder, because businesses are going to have to invest in order to increase the capacity of their supply chains. And if the cost of investment goes up because interest rates go up, they may be less inclined to do it. So this is going to put central banks in a very difficult position this year. And the other big concern about the economy this year is what happens in China. Because of this zero COVID approach that China is taking, you do get these big disruptive lockdowns. Just a handful of cases in a big city like Xi'an, city of 13 million people, they lock the whole city down and test absolutely everybody. And so Omicron could really disrupt economic activity in China this year, and that of course would have implications for the region and for the world. And the Chinese economy has already got some problems. It's very dependent on real estate, which is in trouble, as we've seen with Evergrande. So GDP growth in China is expected to be below 5% this year, and that could have consequences for global growth. On to the future of work. There was a debate at the beginning of the pandemic about the extent to which some companies might go fully remote, and whether sort of working from home, for those of us who can, it's about 50% of the workforce in most developed countries, whether that was going to be the new normal. And now there's a general consensus that actually the future is hybrid, that white-collar workers are going to spend some of their time at home and some of their time in the office. But beyond that basic agreement, there is enormous scope for disagreement about the details. There's disagreement between what bosses want and what workers want. Bosses generally want to be in the office more, and they want people to be in the office more, and workers don't want to be in the office quite so much. So bosses might say, well, come into the office 3 days a week and stay at home 2 days a week. And workers reply, well, actually, we'd like to be at home 3 days a week, or maybe even more than that. And then workers say they want one thing, but if you actually give them a free choice, they stay at home even more than that. They stay at home 4 or 5 days a week, or just stay at home all the time. There are big debates about whether you should specify which days people come in, whether you give them a choice, whether you require particular functions or teams to come in on the same day. And all of this assumes that all workers kind of have the same preferences. And it's very clear that they don't. If you look at this chart from the US, you can see that women and people of colour are less willing to go back to the office. And there's a lot of evidence that managers favour workers that they see and interact with more frequently. So if some groups of workers go back in larger numbers than others, there's a danger that companies are going to go backwards on things like reducing the gender pay gap or on diversity and inclusion. Another group that also expresses strong preferences here is younger workers. Younger workers are keener to go back to the office than older workers because they want to schmooze with the bosses, build their professional networks, and so on. Whereas older workers who have already climbed the ladder are much less inclined to go back. So there's this real danger that the future of the workplace, the hybrid future, is going to be less fair unless it's designed very carefully not to be. And fairness isn't the only thing that needs to be sorted out here. There's going to be the need to update employment law. There's a big debate about surveillance. What's the right amount of surveillance for people working at home? Some companies have been installing software on people's computers to take screenshots and make sure they're not just playing video games all day, or measuring how many keystrokes they're making or how much they're moving the mouse. And this has led, people to buy devices that you plug into the computer and it pretends to move the mouse for you. There are also health and safety questions. There are questions about tax rules when people are spending, if they work for a company in one jurisdiction and they live in another, what does that mean? Who collects the income tax? And then there's a big debate about office space. Do we need more office space or less in a hybrid world? Because if we're going into the office primarily to collaborate and meet with people, then we need more meeting rooms and we need fewer desks and fewer cubicles. And what does that mean for the overall volume of office space that we need? So there's lots of questions to be resolved here. And there aren't going to be easy and simple answers to any of them. The answers are going to vary by function. They're going to vary by industry. We know that tech and finance, for example, are much keener on having people working from home than some other industries are. It's also going to vary by culture. So we know that East Asia, for example, surveys show that in East Asia, bosses are much less keen on remote working, whereas in Western Europe and North America, there's much more openness to the idea. So it's going to take a long time to sort all of this out, but that process of defining the new future of work starts in earnest in 2022. Okay, another big question is what happens to regulation of tech companies? And the big change that we saw in 2021 was that China became the sort of ground zero for cracking down on big tech companies. And you can see this here on the left-hand chart, the crackdown by Xi Jinping, which involved halting the IPOs of some tech companies. Video games were banned during the week for children. Celebrities have been booted off social media. The entire online tutoring sector was made non-profit pretty much overnight. And you can see this has wiped about $1.5 trillion off the market cap of Chinese tech companies. My favorite example of this is video games. No new video games have been approved in China since last July, and you can't release a video game in China without government approval. This has resulted in 14,000 gaming companies shutting down in China. So what's happening here? Xi Jinping wants to remind people who's boss after some tech companies got a bit too big for their boots. Some tech bosses did, like Jack Ma. But he also really wants to change the direction of the Chinese tech industry here. He wants to steer Chinese entrepreneurs away from what he regards as frivolous things like devising new forms of e-commerce or ride-hailing or food delivery. And he wants to steer them towards more exciting, in his view, and important things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and semiconductors, all of which would give China a strategic and military advantage. Now, do we think this is going to work? Well, if you look at the right-hand chart here, you can see that the amount of money going into Chinese startups is going down, and the amount of money going into startups in the US continues to climb. So we think that this approach is much more likely to stifle economic dynamism and hamper innovation and entrepreneurism. And in fact, quite a lot of Chinese tech bosses have suddenly decided to retire and spend more time with their families rather than navigate this extremely unpredictable regulatory environment. So this year, we think that's going to be worth watching and what the impact of that is on Chinese dynamism. But we also think that the focus of tech regulation may well shift to Europe. The EU's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act may pass this year, and they would have, in effect, act as de facto global regulation on American companies. Also in Britain, the Competition and Markets Authority has been casting a very sceptical eye on acquisitions. Nvidia has now given up its pursuit of ARM, for example. So the regulatory road ahead does look bumpier for tech giants than it has of late. Ultimately, though, the thing that keeps tech bosses awake at night is not what regulators are going to do. If you look at the history of technology, the thing that brings big tech companies down is failing to move with the times. So if you think about what happened to Nokia, which fumbled the transition to smartphones, or you think about what happened to IBM, which fumbled the transition to PCs, despite inventing the first PC, that's the kind of mistake that tech bosses are trying not to make. And so they're all frantically looking for the next big thing and investing enormous amounts of money, about $200 billion a year, in fact, for the 5 big American tech companies in all sorts of new things, from self-driving cars to the metaverse to crypto and NFTs and all this sort of thing. And this is why Facebook is changing its name and trying to shift what it's doing, because it doesn't want to miss this big shift. And ultimately, that's what history shows us. It's failure to move with the times that brings tech companies down, not regulation. Speaking of crypto is growing up. And we've seen this movie before. A new exciting technology appears. Its proponents say, this is going to change everything. And then the regulators appear and say, okay, let's make some rules around this because it's the Wild West at the moment. That's very much what's happening with crypto now. At the same time, there is a lot of excitement around distributed finance. So the idea of moving some aspects of finance onto decentralized blockchains. And central banks are also showing a lot of interest in digital currencies of a slightly different sort, not cryptocurrencies, but what are called central bank digital currencies that are issued by them. So I think the way to think about this is that we've got 3 competing visions for the future of finance. One which comes from the tech industry, and that means, if you think about the big Chinese tech companies, WeChat and Tencent and Alibaba, and they both have these big payment systems, WeChat Pay and Alipay, through which about 97% of Chinese payments run. So they control that world. And tech giants in the West have looked at that and said, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we also had that sort of stranglehold on the way people spend money? We get all this amazing data about what everyone was doing. And that was why Facebook was interested in launching its own currency. Again, something it's given up on in recent days. So there was the sort of tech industry approach. And then there's the DeFi crypto blockchain crowd. And they say, well, hang on a minute, those big tech companies have already got too much power and too much centralization. We should be doing this in a new decentralized way on blockchains, although blockchains turn out not to be as decentralized as a lot of people think they are. And then you've got the central banks saying, well, hang on a minute, if someone's going to be dishing out new forms of digital money here, shouldn't it be us? And the fight between these camps is going to intensify in 2022. One of the interesting things that's happening at the moment is China, which is the furthest down the road with issuing a central bank digital currency. It's got about 150 million users of it in China. And it's also using the Winter Olympics as a test bed for extending that model to foreigners as well. So I don't know about you, but when I've visited China, I'm unable to buy things in shops in the way that Chinese can because I haven't got a Chinese bank account, and therefore I can't use WeChat Pay, which relies on having a Chinese bank account in the background. This new central bank digital currency has been built so that it makes it possible for non-Chinese and people who don't have bank accounts to use it. So it's very interesting, and it also allows. And central bank digital currencies generally give central banks superpowers, the ability, for example, to fire stimulus money at everyone in the country much more easily, but also to fire stimulus money at people that then can only be spent in certain ways. So you could fire money at farmers and they can only spend it on agricultural inputs and they can't go and buy a new car. Also, you can fire stimulus money at people that expires after a certain amount of time if it's not spent. So there's some really interesting things you can do with these new digital currencies. They're not cryptocurrencies. They don't necessarily have to involve blockchains, these central bank digital currencies. But I think this is something that more and more central banks are looking closely at. Who is going to decide which of these models prevails? It's going to be regulators, and regulators in different countries are going to have different answers. In many countries, regulators have really clamped down on crypto already, for example, in China. In other countries like Singapore, regulators are being much more welcoming to the crypto and DeFi crowd. And so we're going to get different answers in different places. And there's a big debate about whether the SEC in America is the right body to regulate the crypto industry. It says it is. The crypto industry hates the SEC chairman, Gary Gensler, and says they want a different regulator. So we're going to be hearing a lot about that this year. And ultimately, crypto purists say, they hate regulation. They're doing all of this because they want to escape from the influence of central banks. But crypto is not going to go mainstream without clear rules. So they've got to decide, whether they want to stay pure or whether they want their technology to be more widely adopted. On to energy and the environment. At the end of last year, particularly embarrassing for us in Britain, I think we had the COP26 conference being hosted in Glasgow. And at the same time, we were turning coal-fired power stations back on and reopening coal mines. And this was because the price of energy has shot up. We're very dependent on gas in this country, as is much of Western Europe. And with the price of gas shooting up, suddenly coal looked a lot more attractive. And so we turned on these much dirtier coal plants again, just at the point where world leaders were supposed to be figuring out how we get to net zero and meet the terms of the Paris Agreement. So what's happening here? Well, the underlying problem is that the world is not investing enough in new energy infrastructure. So we need to completely rebuild the energy infrastructure. That's going to cost about $100 trillion over the next 20 years. And we're only spending about $2 trillion a year on this at the moment. We need to be spending $5 trillion a year. So the solution both to the short-term energy crunch, but also to the longer-term problem of climate change is more investment in energy infrastructure. That does include investment in natural gas in the medium term as a bridge fuel for countries that are very reliant on coal. Natural gas is a lot better than coal, cuts emissions in half, but obviously doesn't cut to zero. And it also means more emphasis on nuclear, which will really help get to net zero. One good piece of news, COP26 was generally a bit of a disappointment, but one good thing that came out of it was signs that America and China might be willing to cooperate on climate, even as they disagree in other areas. but also that many more countries have now pledged to get to net zero by the middle of the century. Such pledges now cover 90% of the world economy, up from 30% in 2020. So that's good news. Now, that said, it's very easy for politicians to promise that something's going to happen in the future after they've left office. So we really need more details from this, and we may get more details at the COP27 event in Egypt at the end of this year, which is going to be a bigger COP than usual. Normally you get a small COP after a big COP, and this is going to be a medium-sized COP. So one thing we can be sure of this year is we're going to continue to see unpredictable and extreme weather, and maybe that will focus minds, and we'll get more details about how to get to net zero. On to travel. It's coming back slowly. The Omicron variant has disrupted what seemed to be a gradual reopening of travel and tourism, and that reopening is now underway again. Places that had previously pursued suppression strategies like Australia and New Zealand and Taiwan are now reopening their borders again. The big exception, of course, is still China, which wants to keep its borders tightly sealed this year for reasons I've already mentioned. But China aside, we'll see how the reopening proceeds. And I think there are two things to watch for this year in particular. The first is the use of sandboxes. And this is a strategy pioneered by Thailand, sort of borrowed from the Maldives. In the Maldives, every island is its own resort, and they have very, very strict testing. And what Thailand did was say, well, could we use part of the country, and in particular, the resort island of Phuket, as a sort of sandbox where we vaccinate all of the people who work in hospitality, and we test people coming in as tourists very, very carefully, and we make sure they're vaccinated. And then they can spend 2 weeks on Phuket, and then they can either go home, or if they want to move on to other sites on the mainland, they are then able to do so. So you sort of use Phuket as a luxury quarantine resort. And that's a very smart model, because it means that you still maintain your tourism revenues, which is 20% of GDP for Thailand. And there are a lot of countries in Asia that are very reliant on tourism revenues. So you find a way to strike a balance between allowing tourism and also minimizing the spread of infections. And so other Asian countries are starting to look at similar models. And I think we're going to hear more about that this year. But I think the broader point here is that there's a lot of scope for innovation, for new ways to handle travel in the coming months and years, when we're probably going to have a very unpredictable environment. We've still got all the security measures in place after 9/11. When you add these new sorts of measures like testing and vaccine passports, they're likely to be with us for many years. And so I think there's a lot of scope for countries to come up with these sorts of new models. The second thing to watch this year is business travel, and to what extent it bounces back. It didn't bounce back to its previous levels after 9/11 or after the global financial crisis. And it's not expected to this time. And in fact, it's much less likely to, because businesses have figured out how to use video calling. The technology's got a lot better, and they've figured out that they can save a lot of money by reducing certainly internal travel. So I think going to see people, to look them in the eye, shake them by the hand and close a deal, that's still going to happen. But other forms of travel may suffer. And some people are going as far as saying that a third or even a half of all business travel could be gone for good. That would be good for the planet, but it would be bad for tourists, because their tickets and their hotels are subsidized by higher spending business travelers. On to space, one destination that was very popular in 2021. We saw a couple of dozen people go to space as tourists last year, and we're going to see even more people go to space as tourists this year. In fact, it should be the first year that more people go to space as paying passengers than as government employees. And we've got 3 companies leading the charge here: SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic. And the rivalry between them is really what's driving this. We're also seeing the more traditional rivalry this year between global powers, for whom space is an arena to show just how powerful and technologically advanced they are. China will be finishing its space station this year, which will be permanently inhabited. And India is having another go at sending a robotic probe to the moon. The last one it sent didn't work, so fingers crossed for this one. And we also saw the launch of a space probe last year that will complete its mission this year. It sounds like a Hollywood movie, but it's a real space mission. It's where NASA is going to smack a space probe into an asteroid to change its orbit and see how much its orbit changes. And this is a rehearsal in case we ever have to do this. If we find an asteroid on a collision course with the Earth, how effective would it be to smack a space probe into it? So this particular asteroid is not any danger at all to the Earth. It's in a completely different orbit, but this is an experiment to see how that works. All of this, however, could very easily be upstaged by this beast here, which is the new SpaceX rocket, Starship, comfortably the biggest rocket ever built, and it may make its first orbital flight in the next couple of months. If it works, it could transform the economics of putting people and things into space even more dramatically than SpaceX has done already. I mean, they've already made a massive difference to the economics of spaceflight, but this could reduce costs even further. So definitely worth keeping an eye on that. Finally, sport. The Winter Olympics now underway in Beijing, and the World Cup in Qatar at the end of the year, because nobody wants to play football or indeed do anything else outdoors in Qatar in the summer, will be reminders of how sporting events can bring the world together and unite people, but also how big sporting events can become political footballs. So expect protests and boycotts directed at the host countries. We're seeing that now with the Beijing Olympics. Some people are saying you shouldn't even be watching it, and if you do, you're supporting the Chinese government, and we should, be turning off our TVs in protest. Clearly, foreign spectators aren't allowed to go at all to the Winter Olympics. You can't really boycott something that you're not invited to in the first place. But world leaders and dignitaries and diplomats from many countries have refused to go. And we're also seeing social media campaigns being launched against sponsors outside China, Western sponsors of the Olympics, saying, are you really sure that this is something you want to be associated with? And I think we're going to see more of the same with the World Cup in Qatar. We did see teams from the Netherlands, Germany and Norway protesting against the choice of Qatar as host country because of its repressive laws and poor treatment of migrant workers who built the stadiums. But in neither of these cases are we seeing countries refusing to send their teams altogether. So it's not like the Moscow Olympics of 1980, where there was an actual boycott. So the athletes are all still competing. And instead, the contest and the protests are happening off stage and in places like on social media. And this is going to put many companies in a difficult position. They don't want to offend their customers in China, and they don't want to offend China, but they also don't want to offend their customers outside China. So lots of scope for debate and disagreement there. Okay, those are my themes and predictions for 2022. I hope you found that helpful. And now let's go to Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. A fascinating run through of predictions. To summarize that would be ridiculously unfair to, I think, to allow people to start asking questions. This is your chance to do that. I thought I have prepared a few questions I can start with. The first one is perhaps, how do you make predictions?
Well, in this case, we get the staff together. It used to be in the conference room at The Economist. Obviously, it's been on Zoom the last couple of years. But we get them together and we ply them with, you expected me to say alcohol, but actually we ply them with tea and coffee and an enormous number of sticky buns and pastries. And the result is a huge sugar rush. And everyone gets very carried away and say, I ask them, well, what's going to be the most important thing on your patch next year? And we write down what everyone says. But what's wonderful about it is that sort of people build on each other's ideas, or we spot connections, and we have different ideas, and they say, oh, this is a person to watch, or this is a company to watch. So we have a sort of stream of consciousness meeting, and we write everything down, and then I have to go away and turn it into a sort of coherent table of contents. And then that table of contents, I first produced that in June, and then that evolves. We have to just constantly update it and tweak it and fiddle with it until about the middle of October, which is when we've got something that we might plausibly be able to go to press with. And we have to have it ready at that point, and it's all sort of checked and proofread and all the rest of it. And then we have this rather agonizing 2 weeks where we hope that there won't be massive news and something really unpredictable isn't going to happen. And of course, it's a terrible time of year to be doing it, because that's exactly when America holds its elections. And so this year, so we've had nightmare episodes in the past where, particularly 2000, I wasn't working on this publication then, but that was a total nightmare because it wasn't clear until, the end of the year who was going to be the next president. And so we have to plan very, very carefully, and we sometimes have to write rather artfully if we're not quite sure what's going to happen. But yeah, essentially it's drawing on the hive mind of the Economist, and also on these outside experts who we ask to sort of add their own viewpoints and their own predictions as well.
So on that same vein, before I open up the floor, so you mentioned the Omicron variant, you mentioned Ukraine. Is there anything else, if you look back, that you should have had as a prediction for 22?
So I think Omicron, we should have, So one of the things I have to do is I have to write an article looking back each year, and so I wrote one for World Ahead 2022, and we had a pretty good year in 2021. In part because of the pandemic. So we knew that the pandemic was going to be the biggest story in many countries and many industries. So we kind of had one of the big stories of the year sort of in advance. That said, we hadn't, last year, we failed to anticipate, we said there would be some vaccine hesitancy, but we failed to anticipate the extent to which refusing to be vaccinated will become a political statement for some people. And we also didn't mention the word variant last year, which was a mistake. And we could possibly have made more of that this year. But anyway, I think the Ukraine situation has all blown up more quickly. I don't know whether we could have seen that one coming. And then the other thing that's on the domestic front, the instability. I mean, we always knew that Boris Johnson was on a bit of a sticky wicket, but all of the stuff that emerged about the lockdown breaking parties in Downing Street has all emerged since then. And we've actually, for each of the past couple of years, we've said that Boris Johnson's star could very quickly fall, and it looks like that's most likely to happen this year.
So turning to the first question and I do urge questions to be raised in the Q&A. You've got another 18 minutes, so please raise them. The first is from Andrew Walton. It's very interesting. In China and Russia used day one of the Olympics to declare a deep strategic partnership, quote, to balance US influence and to build a new international order based on their own interpretations of human rights and democracy. Very much picking up your point in a way. What actions and activities might we see as a result of these new updated relationship? Very good question.
No, very good question. And I think, of course, they're in quite analogous positions. So for Russia, the big nightmare is having a functional democracy in the form of Ukraine on its doorstep, because that's a sort of direct riposte to the way that Putin thinks that Russia should be run. So this is why he's been trying to destabilize Ukraine for many years and can't stand the idea that Ukraine might become a normal European country. And China has a very similar situation with Taiwan, which is a Chinese democracy on its doorstep and is itself a riposte to the way that China chooses to run things on the mainland. So part of that agreement between China and Russia was they respect each other's claims in regard to those two countries and their spheres of influence. I think the thing to remember is Russia is very much the junior partner here. I mean, it's almost a client state of China in some respects. China is its biggest customer for energy, and if Russia does decide to shut off gas to Eastern Europe or to Europe more generally, as part of the current pressuring of Europe to try and get concessions on security, that it seems to be what Putin is after. He seems to have said this is the moment to try it because I've got 630 billion in foreign reserves in the bank. It's winter, so it'll be really painful if I reach for the gas tap. And America is very divided. Half the Republican Party thinks that America should be siding with Russia. And after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there is very clearly no appetite at all from America for foreign adventures. And so this is, Putin has said, this is the moment. I've got maximum leverage to try and get some sort of concessions out of Europe and out of NATO on expansion and so forth. That seems to be what's going through his head. So, but I think looking at the China-Russia relationship more broadly, there aren't many occasions where Putin likes to admit or will admit that he's the junior partner, but this is a rare example of that being the case. China is a much larger economy, and Russia is essentially dependent on it in some respects because it's the biggest customer of its oil and gas, and that dependency would deepen if Russia decided to start shutting off gas taps. So I think we should think about it in that context, that this isn't a partnership of equals by any means.
Very interesting. So I still urge participants to raise their questions. In the meantime, I thought I'd pick up your point 3. And you mentioned the inflation that is perhaps higher than was anticipated. One phrase I heard used around this was that it's the wrong inflation. And you were touching on that, and it's very difficult to understand. If the price
that's exactly right. Can
you explain that to us, please?
Yes, it's a different sort of inflation because it's So if you think about what happened in the 70s, stagflation. So we had low economic growth, we had high unemployment, and we had high inflation. This is a very, very different situation. Essentially, what you've got now is overheating economies, in part because of the stimulus that was applied during the pandemic. And so you've got lots of Americans with stimulus money in their bank accounts, and they want to spend it on things, and that's straining supply chains and pushing up prices. And then you've also got the situation where we haven't got a high unemployment. We've got the opposite. We've got labour shortages. We've got many companies cannot find people to work, and they're having to raise wages. So it's a very different situation from the stagflation of the 1970s. And one of the lessons we learned from that was there was genuinely a debate about what the best way to fight inflation was, and was it to raise interest rates, and that became orthodoxy. And the problem, as I said, is that this time around we do have to raise interest rates. That is the main weapon we have. The other weapons would be to cut government spending or to raise taxes, and I don't think anybody wants to do those things. But there are very few examples of where inflation can be successfully tamed by raising interest rates without causing a recession. So what do you do? This is really, really difficult. And then also that weapon is less effective than it has been in previous crises, because the causes of the inflation are things like people having to isolate, disruptions to supply chains, and raising inflation doesn't fix those or makes those things worse. So this is a really treacherous environment for central banks, particularly in the US this year, and it's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to. The other thing you could do is you could wait. You could say, well, let's just hope that this all runs through the system, that the supply chains unbung themselves, that energy prices start to fall. But then you have higher inflation for longer. And if you're Joe Biden, you are essentially you're getting it in the neck from your opponents who are saying, look, my paycheck is being eroded by this high inflation. So you might want to be seen to be doing something sooner. So yeah, it's just really, really difficult there is no easy way to address this particular flavor of inflation.
So that leads in quite interestingly, a segue into Sophia Larsson's question. So first, thanks for a very interesting presentation. And on the democracy autocracy topic, she says, it would be interesting to hear your view on how there is not only contention between different ideologies on a geopolitical level, but also domestically within already democratic countries and unions. The polarization, which is something you haven't really touched on, but is out there, between political parties in the US and within the EU would be examples of this. How do you think this affects the battle of ideologies on a global scale?
Absolutely. So I think the rise of populism and the democratic recession go together, and it all goes back to the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis was widely perceived to be governments bailing out the rich and then imposing austerity policies that hurt everybody else, and that paved the way for the rise of populist leaders in many democracies who, populists offer simplistic answers to complicated problems, and they haven't been able to solve the problems that companies have. And we've seen some countries tacking back towards a sort of more technocratic approach. A good example of this would be Italy, which had some interesting populist politicians popping up in the 2010s, but is now taking a much more technocratic approach to things. And so one of the big questions is, how does the pandemic influence people's attitudes towards populism? Populist politicians have generally done a terrible job of fighting the pandemic, and so you would hope that would mean that voters would be less keen on them. And the polarization that we've seen is a reflection of whether you go along with the rise of populist leaders in your country, or whether you try to sort of stay rooted in reality and take a more pragmatic approach. So that's why I say that those particular elections in France, Brazil, and Hungary are so worth watching, because if we are going to finally see the tide turning against populism, then those are some of the places that you might see it first. But I'm very aware that this sounds like wishful thinking from those liberals at The Economist in their ivory towers, and I'm not holding my breath. But we do monitor this at the EIU and other organizations around the world publish these annual indices of what's happening with democracy, and we've seen things get worse ever since the global financial crisis. And what's striking, I think, is the response of governments to the pandemic. They've clearly learned from what happened after the global financial crisis. They have prioritized protecting people's jobs and their standards of living through stimulus, rather than managing the national debt, which is what they were doing after the global financial crisis. They said it's really important that we pay down these debts, so we're all just going to have to, cut back and deal with austerity for a few years. That's the opposite. They've done the opposite this time around, and I think that was a lesson from the global financial crisis and the political consequences that came from that, which were polarization and populism.
So that sounds almost positive, but almost. Let's see what we get to. Yes, exactly. Fingers crossed. Now, in more looking at a very interesting question here is again, thank you for a great presentation. I could not agree more. So which major business sectors do you believe will be setting the scene for 2022, or which will be the major companies driving development and next big leaps within business and new behaviors? For example, which of the major tech giants will be most relevant for 2022, and who will struggle the most? Thinking a little bit on Facebook and the challenges during 21.
Yes, Facebook is struggling because its core product, the blue app, as they call it, is now in decline. It's if you ask your children, they consider it a place where old people talk about stuff, and it's very much something that younger people aren't using. Facebook is very worried about missing the transition to the next big thing, and has placed a very, very big bet on the next big thing being the metaverse. And has even changed its name. And this is partly because it wants to change the subject from its other woes, but it's also because it does genuinely, Zuckerberg he genuinely believes that's the next big thing. And I think he is onto something. And it's not just Facebook that's pushing this idea of the metaverse. Quite a lot of big video gaming companies and other tech companies are as well. Microsoft has big investments here. Apple has yet to show its hand, but is thought to be working on this too. And in fact, there was a leak yesterday that it seems to be closer than we thought to having something to show people this year. So I do think this is real, and I would say that because I'm a gamer and I love video games, and I have a VR headset over here, the Oculus Quest 2, which is, I've been doing workouts in VR, for the past 18 months, playing Beat Saber. So I'm a big fan of all this stuff. But what I see is that now that we're in a hybrid work environment, people have more of an appetite than they did a couple of years ago for new ways to collaborate with people. And this sort of situation where we have boxes on screens, I think we would all agree that there's got to be better ways of doing things than boxes on screens. And there's an enormous opportunity for companies to develop new tools. We've seen lots of new tools pop up, plugins for Zoom, online collaboration systems like Miro that you may have used, and things like that. And I think there's a very, very much further to go on that. The future of hybrid work, this is as big a change as the rise of factories or the rise of office workers. And so we are going to need completely new tools and ways of doing things. And I would be very surprised if that doesn't involve a much bigger emphasis on 3D environments. Now, that doesn't mean you necessarily have to be wearing a helmet. But if you think about how our children use the internet, it is already a 3D environment. If you're in Minecraft, you're in Roblox, you're playing Fortnite, this is a 3D environment where you meet your friends and hang out after school. And I think there's a there, and I think we are going to hear more about it. But of course, history tells us that, as we saw with IBM or with Nokia, the company that tries to lead the way doesn't always end up winning in the end. And so that is what Mark Zuckerberg is most scared of.
So quickly then, trying to summarize some of these questions coming in. One is about, if you look at the widening gap in the free market economies between rich and poor. We talk about, energy poverty is one thing. Do we risk seeing social unrest, not just in countries, but perhaps also between countries?
Yes, and history shows us this. If you analyze pandemics, and there's been some very good work done on this with things like Ebola and Zika outbreaks in Africa, you can see that you get an uptick in in social unrest, and you tend to get it 2 years after the pandemic begins. So we would expect to see that this year if this was going to happen. But I also think that there has been a recognition that by politicians, and this goes back to what I said earlier on, very often one of the consequences of crises, whether it's a pandemic or some other kind of crisis, is that it's easier for rich people to manage. And crises have the effect of increasing, but also highlighting inequality. And that has definitely been the case here. If you've got a nice home and you've got lots of computers and fast broadband, it's much easier to cope with the pandemic than if you haven't got all of those things. And I think that's something that governments have recognized. And that's why there's been, quite generous stimulus and support packages in many countries, because governments recognize the political danger that they are at here. And we saw some measures of inequality and poverty go down during the pandemic because these stimulus programs were so big. So those stimulus programs are coming to an end now. And this is the year when you were going to see an uptick in social unrest. Maybe we saw a lot of protests around the world about all sorts of things last year, no particular theme uniting them. We've got these strange protests with truckers that seem to be metastasizing from Canada to other parts of Europe. Suddenly there are these trucker convoys popping up in Europe. This does look coordinated. It does look astroturfed. We don't know who's behind it. But yes, I think this is the year when, if we are going to see greater unrest as a consequence of the pandemic, it would manifest itself most clearly.
And you did mention something, and picking on one of the questions, in terms of risk for unrest, the obvious one, and if and only if that were to happen, Russia were to blitz or to, let's say, attack the Ukraine in the spring, what do you think the West's reaction would be? How would sanctions and potential military interventions split the West? And how would China react?
Well, China has made its position clear that it doesn't think that both China and Russia have talked about how much they object to the West interfering in their affairs, and so China would be obviously on Russia's side if there was a direct military response from the West. But I think it is more likely to be indirect support, and also a massive round of economic sanctions. Now, we don't know how effective they'd be, and they could actually backfire in some respects. So if, for example, Russia was thrown out of the SWIFT system, that would merely accelerate efforts for Russia, which already has its own alternative to SWIFT. It would just build that up faster. China similarly has an alternative to SWIFT. And SWIFT is supposed to be a neutral international body. And so if it starts to be used in political ways like that, that really, reveals that that's not the case at all. So we don't know how effective that would be. But I think the big concern here is that if the sanctions are look feeble, if the West doesn't look like it's responding sufficiently forcefully, then it's open season for other countries around the world that would like to have some military adventures, whether it's China in Taiwan, whether it's Iran doing things. It's clear that America's not going to do anything, the West's not going to do anything, so now's the time. And now's the time for us to make our move. And that's the really, frightening prospect here, that this could be the first domino, and it could cause all sorts of other things to unravel around the world.
So that's something to keep an eye on. Of course, I fear that we have more questions left than we have time. We talked about energy poverty. I think time poverty is what we're suffering from right now. We have 2 minutes left. Peter, I'm not sure whether if we have time for one more question. Otherwise, I hand back to you. Wrapping up Tom's presentation and the questions is something that would be immensely difficult. The knowledge and thinking through this has been fantastic to listen to. Peter.
Thank you. And thank you, Tom, for a fantastic presentation and for sharing your analysis and insight. I think we're living in a world, as you can tell, where there's so many questions and so few answers, and I find that quite disturbing, but also a little bit exciting. Thank you also to Tomas for chairing today's conversation, as always, much appreciated. And finally, thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you all soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.